Every woman in Redemption Creek had spoken to Milton Sawyer at least once. Every woman except Minnie Callahan. And the whole town had begun to wonder whether that fact bothered him at all. Right up until the morning he rode past her fence 4 times in a single hour, and could not bring himself to stop. Redemption Creek sat in the low flatlands of the Texas Panhandle in the autumn of 1882. A town that had grown up along a creek bed the way most frontier towns grew, slowly at first and then all at once, pushed into existence by cattle drives and railroad surveys, and the stubborn optimism of people who believed that hard ground could be made into something worth staying for. There were 2 saloons, a general store run by a man named Hector Briggs who weighed every ounce of flour as though his life depended on it, a livery stable, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a scattering of homes that ranged from solid wooden structures to sod houses that hunched against the wind, as though they expected to be knocked down at any moment. Milton Sawyer had ridden into Redemption Creek 6 weeks before the story of Minnie Callahan began to matter. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders and narrow at the jaw, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar when it got too long, and brown eyes that had been described by more than one woman in town as the color of good coffee. He had taken a job at the Double Cross Ranch outside of town, working cattle for a rancher named Aldous Greer, who was known to be fair with wages and hard with expectations. Milton was good at the work. He had been doing it since he was 15, and he wore the evidence of it in his hands and in the unhurried way he moved, as though time was something you measured in seasons rather than hours. He was also, by any honest accounting, charming. Not in the slippery way of men who practice being charming in front of mirrors, but in the effortless way of a man who genuinely liked people and did not bother to hide it. He had a habit of remembering names and small details. He knew that Hector Briggs's wife had passed 3 winters ago, and that Hector still sometimes ordered 2 cups of coffee out of habit. He knew that the widow Forsyth kept geraniums in her window even in the cold, and that she appreciated it when someone noticed them. He had spoken with the schoolteacher, Miss Agnes Polk, about the lack of books available to the children. He had introduced himself to the Reverend and the Reverend's wife and the Reverend's wife's sister, who was visiting from Amarillo. He had shaken hands with the blacksmith and the banker and the man who drove the stage line through once a week. And through all of this, through 6 weeks of easy conversation and Sunday appearances and regular stops at Briggs's general store, he had never once spoken to Minnie Callahan. This was not entirely for lack of trying, though the trying had been so gentle that it barely qualified as effort. The first time he had seen her, she had been leaving the general store with a basket over one arm and a look on her face that suggested she was thinking about something much more important than the street in front of her. She had auburn hair that she wore pinned up, though pieces of it always seemed to be making bids for freedom, and her eyes were a particular shade of green that stopped being easy to describe after you stared at them for more than a second. She was 24 years old, and she had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years prior with her father, Seamus Callahan, who had come west to try his hand at growing wheat on a quarter section of land east of town. Seamus Callahan had died of a fever the previous spring, and Minnie had stayed on, working the land with a stubbornness that impressed people and worried them in equal measure. She was not the only woman in Redemption Creek who kept to herself, but she was the one who did it most thoroughly. She was polite when spoken to, pleasant even, but she had a way of keeping conversations short that was not rude so much as it was complete. People left interactions with Minnie Callahan feeling that they had been addressed, answered, and dismissed all in the space of 30 seconds, and they were not quite sure how it had happened. She had spoken to Hector Briggs because she had to buy things. She had spoken to the Reverend because a body had to be buried and prayers had to be said over it. She had spoken to the widow Forsyth because the widow was simply impossible to walk past without acknowledging. But she had not spoken to Milton Sawyer, and after a while, That absence became its own kind of presence in the small social architecture of Redemption Creek. Agnes Polk was the one who first put it into words. She was sitting with the widow Forsythe on the bench outside the millinery one Thursday afternoon when Milton rode past on his bay horse, tipping his hat to them with the easy grace he brought to everything. And Agnes said, without particularly intending to stir anything up, that as far as she could tell, Minnie Callahan was the only woman in town who had not exchanged so much as a good morning with that man. The widow Forsythe considered this with the solemnity it deserved. "She's not unfriendly," the widow said finally. "She's careful." "Careful of what?" Agnes asked. The widow looked down the street in the direction of the Callahan quarter section, which lay beyond the edge of town and out of sight, and she said, "That's the question, isn't it?" Milton heard about this conversation the way people in small towns always hear about things that concern them, which is to say indirectly and probably with some details changed. It was Hector Briggs who mentioned it, not because he was a gossip, but because he was a man who believed in honesty, and he thought Milton ought to know that people were noticing things. He said it carefully, the way a man arranges boxes in a small space, making sure nothing fell over. "Not saying it means anything," Hector said, sliding a sack of tobacco across the counter. "Just saying people notice." "I've noticed too," Milton said, and he said it quietly, looking at the tobacco rather than at Hector, and there was something in the way he said it that made Hector Briggs think this was not idle conversation. Milton had noticed Minnie Callahan the way you notice weather on the horizon, something that demanded your attention, not because it was directly overhead, but because it had the potential to become something significant. He had not approached her because something in the way she moved through the world suggested she was not a woman who welcomed approach as a general principle, and he respected that. But he had also not stopped thinking about her, which was a separate thing entirely. He began to pay attention to her patterns, not in a way that was surveillance so much as observation, the same careful watching he gave to cattle or to the weather or to anything else in his life that he needed to understand before he engaged with it. He knew that she came into town on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually in the late morning. He knew that she bought flour and lamp oil and occasionally fabric, and that she always checked the quality of the flour before she paid for it, pressing her fingers into it with an expression of critical concentration that he found, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, entirely compelling. He knew that she walked with purpose, never browsing, never lingering in the way that most people lingered when town offered a break from solitary work. And he knew that she had a small scar along her left jawline that she had gotten. He had learned from Hector Briggs, from a piece of flying fence post when a windstorm had taken half her fence down the previous summer. What he did not know was what to say to her. This was unusual. Milton Sawyer had never in his adult life been at a loss for something to say to a person. He had talked to Apache men on the trail with nothing but hand signs and determination. He had talked his way out of more than one tense situation in saloons where tension had been the currency of the room. But Minnie Callahan, with her green eyes and her careful manner and her absolute self-containment, made him feel as though every sentence he had ever constructed was suddenly inadequate. He was on his way back from delivering a message for Aldous Greer to the land office when he saw her standing in front of Briggs's store with her basket on her arm and a look of pure frustration on her face. She was staring at a wheel on her wagon, and the wheel was leaning at an angle that made it very clear that something was wrong with it. The wagon was a modest thing, a single-horse rig that she used for hauling goods back and forth from her claim, and it looked as though the wheel had been threatening to give out for some time and had finally made good on the threat. Minnie put her basket down on the steps of the store and crouched beside the wheel, examining it with the same critical attention she gave the flour. She pressed the spokes, tested the rim, and then stood up and pushed her hair back from her face in a gesture that managed to be both practical and exasperated. Milton was off his horse before he had made a conscious decision to be off his horse. "Looks like the hubs worked loose," he said. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was not hostile but was absolutely evaluating, the way a person looks at an unexpected development to determine whether it is good or bad before committing to a reaction. "I can see that," she said. "I can fix it," he said, "if you'll let me." There was a pause, not a dramatic one, but the kind that has weight in it, the kind where a person is genuinely deciding something. "You're Milton Sawyer," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said. "You work for Aldous Greer." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you actually know how to fix a wheel hub, or are you telling me you know because you want something to do?" He felt, entirely against his will, the beginning of a smile. "I've fixed more wheel hubs than I can count," he said. "But I understand why you'd want to establish that before you let me touch your wagon." She looked at him for another moment, and then she said, "Well, go ahead then." And that was how Milton Sawyer finally spoke to Minnie Callahan, crouched in the dust in front of Hector Briggs's general store with a wheel hub in his hands, and the whole town pretending not to watch through windows. He had the wheel fixed in 20 minutes. It was not a complicated repair, requiring only the tools that Briggs kept in a box behind his counter and some grease from the livery down the street, which Milton fetched himself. Minnie stood nearby and watched him work with the same unsentimental attention she seemed to bring to everything, and Milton found himself talking while he worked, which was something he did naturally, and which he could not have stopped even if he had wanted to. He talked about the ranch and the cattle work, about the way the panhandle looked in the early morning when the light came in flat and turned everything gold. He talked about a particularly difficult bull that he and the other hands had been trying to move from one pasture to another for 3 days running, and that seemed to have a personal grievance against the entire concept of being moved. He did not ask her questions, not yet, because he could sense that questions would feel like pressure, and he was not interested in pressure. He just talked, the way you talk to a skittish horse, steadily and without expectation, giving the sound of his voice as something to get used to. She did not speak much, but he noticed that after a while she stopped watching his hands and started watching his face. That seemed like something. When the wheel was done, he stood and wiped his hands on a rag he had borrowed from Briggs. She reached into her basket, and he thought for a moment she was going to offer him money, which would have been both practical and a little deflating, but what she brought out instead was an apple. "From my tree," she said. "It's not much, but it's what I have." He took the apple. "It's plenty," he said. She loaded her basket into the wagon and climbed up to the seat with an efficiency that suggested she had been climbing up to wagon seats by herself for long enough that it no longer required any thought. She picked up the reins and then looked down at him where he stood beside his horse with the apple in one hand. "Thank you, Mr. Sawyer," she said. "Milton," he said. She considered this. "Thank you, Milton," she said, and then she drove away, and he stood there watching until the wagon rounded the corner at the end of the street and disappeared. Hector Briggs was leaning in the doorway of his store. "Well," Hector said. "Well," Milton agreed, and he bit into the apple. The apple was the best apple he had ever eaten. He would not have been able to say whether it was actually superior to other apples or whether he simply wanted it to be, and in that moment he decided the distinction did not matter. He thought about Minnie Callahan for the rest of the day. He thought about the way she had stood with her arms crossed while he worked, not because she was cold but because she was watching, and the way she had eventually uncrossed them as the work progressed, as though she had made some determination. He thought about the scar on her jaw and the pieces of hair that kept escaping their pins, and the way she had said his name, steady and clear, like something she was trying out to see how it sounded. He went back to the ranch and worked through the afternoon and ate supper with the other hands, a group of men who were pleasant enough and who left him largely alone with his thoughts, which he appreciated. That night he lay on his bunk in the bunkhouse and listened to the wind moving over the grass outside, and decided that he was going to make it his business to know Minnie Callahan, not because she was a challenge or because the town was watching or because he had anything to prove, but because something about her had gotten under his skin in a way he recognized as significant. And he was 32 years old. No, wait, 28. And he had been moving from ranch to ranch long enough to know that significant things did not come along so often that you could afford to be careless with them. The following Tuesday, he arranged to be in town at the same time she usually arrived. He did not engineer a collision or manufacture an emergency. He simply made sure he was in the vicinity of Briggs's general store when she tied her horse to the rail and went inside. He was talking to Hector about the possibility of ordering a new coil of rope when she came through the door, and he turned and said, "Good morning, Minnie," with the ease of someone who had been saying it for years. She stopped, not dramatically, just a slight interruption in her forward motion. "Good morning," she said, and she went to the counter and began looking at the bolts of fabric that Hector kept on a shelf behind the glass case. Milton finished his conversation with Hector about the rope, collected his tobacco, and wandered in the direction of the fabric shelf with the specific aimlessness of a man who is not going anywhere but wants to end up near a particular person. "Looking for something for the house?" he asked. "Curtains," she said, not looking up from the fabric. "The ones I have are letting in cold air and winter's coming." "What kind of fabric works best for that, do you think?" She glanced at him sideways. "Heavier weight, something woven tight." She touched a bolt of dark blue wool. "This would do." "It's a good color," he said. "It's practical," she said. "Can't something be both?" She looked at him then, a full look, not the sideways assessing kind but a direct one, and he thought he saw the very faint edge of something that might have been amusement if given the right conditions to develop. "I suppose it can," she said. He helped her carry the fabric to the wagon. She did not ask him to, and he did not offer in a way that made it an imposition. He simply picked up the bolt when she had it paid for and carried it to the wagon door, the way one person does a small thing for another person without making a production of it. She watched him secure it in the wagon bed and she said nothing, but she also did not protest. "Do you have someone to help you put them up?" he asked. "I'll manage," she said. "I don't doubt it," he said. "I was going to offer, but only if you'd find it useful." Another pause. He was beginning to appreciate her pauses. They were not the pauses of a woman who did not know what she thought. They were the pauses of a woman who knew exactly what she thought and was deciding whether to share it. "Saturday," she said finally. "I'll be putting them up Saturday afternoon if you're not needed at the ranch." "Saturday afternoon," he said. "I'll be there." He showed up Saturday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a hammer and a level, and nothing but the best intentions. The Callahan place was a solid house for the territory, not large but well built, with a porch that faced east and a kitchen garden on the south side that was mostly finished for the season but showed signs of having been ambitious. The apple tree she had mentioned stood in the corner of the yard, its branches nearly bare now, a few last leaves clinging with the same stubbornness that characterized. He was beginning to think everything about Minnie Callahan. She opened the door before he knocked, which told him she had heard him coming up the track. "You brought a level," she said, looking at it. "Curtains need to hang straight," he said. She opened the door wider to let him in. The house was clean and spare and completely itself, which was to say it reflected the person who lived in it in the way that living spaces always do if the person has been there long enough to stop pretending. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no fussy details, but the things that were there were well chosen and well placed. A braided rug in front of the fireplace, a shelf of books that surprised him, a table that had been scrubbed so many times the wood had gone pale. She showed him the windows and explained where she wanted the rods, and he listened and measured and marked while she made coffee in the kitchen. They worked through the afternoon companionably, which surprised him because he had not expected her to be someone who made company feel easy. But she did. She handed him things before he asked for them, and she held things steady when he needed them held, and she made jokes, dry and quiet, that he had to be paying attention to catch, and he found himself laughing more in that afternoon than he had laughed in months. "You've done this before," she said, watching him set a bracket into the window frame with particular attention to detail. "A little bit of everything," he said. "That's what cowboying teaches you. You spend enough time on the range and you either learn to fix things or you learn to live without things." "What did you choose?" "Both," he said, "depending on the day." She brought out the curtains she had sewn from the dark blue wool, and he hung them, and when they fell into place against the windows they looked exactly right, heavy and straight and the color of deep water. She stood back and looked at them with her arms crossed, and he watched her face, and the expression she wore was not exactly satisfaction, but it was in the same family. "Good," she said. "They'll hold the cold out," he said. That was the idea. He stayed for supper. Not because he had engineered it, but because she asked, in the offhand way of someone who has thought about doing something and then decided to just do it. She made beans and cornbread, and there was a jar of preserved peaches on the table that she opened without comment, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and ate and talked, really talked, in a way that surprised them both. She told him about her father, carefully at first and then with more ease, about how Seamus Callahan had come west with a head full of dreams that were slightly larger than his means, but not by so much that they were unreasonable. She talked about the wheat and how hard the first year had been, the soil fighting them every step, and how in the second year they had finally gotten a harvest that made the whole enterprise feel like it might work, and how Seamus had died in March before the spring wheat could go in, and how she had put it in herself. "By yourself," Milton said. "I hired help for 2 days," she said. "Neighbor boy Clem Dawson, he's 14. He did what he could. That's a lot of land for one person." "It is," she said without self-pity. "But it's mine. My father bought it and worked it, and I mean to hold on to it." He looked at her across the table, and something shifted in his chest, a kind of recognition that was not quite understanding but was adjacent to it. He knew what it was to hold onto something through sheer will. He knew what it cost. "What happened to your mother?" he asked, because the conversation had opened that door, and because he thought she was someone who would rather be asked directly than have people dance around things. "She died when I was 9, she said. "Fever, same as my father in the end. The fever that comes in spring." "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it the way people mean things when they have earned the right to mean them. "It was a long time ago," she said. "My father was enough. He was more than enough." They sat with that for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "What about you?" she asked. "You've been in Redemption Creek 6 weeks, and I know you work for Greer, but nobody seems to know where you came from before that." "People have been asking," he said, not with any particular defensiveness, just noting it. "People notice things here," she said. "It's a small place." "I came from the Cimarron country," he said. "Before that, Kansas. Before that, my father's place in Missouri, which I left when I was 15 because my father, and I had the kind of disagreement that doesn't resolve." "What kind is that?" "The kind where you're 15 and he's 40 and you're both certain you're right, and one of you gets on a horse and rides and the other one stays behind and is probably still certain he was right." He turned his coffee cup between his hands. "I sent him a letter 2 years ago. He wrote back, 'We're not close, but we're not enemies anymore.'" "That's something," she said. "It is," he agreed. He rode back to the ranch that night under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had been careless with them, scattered them without arranging them, and he felt a kind of fullness that he recognized as happiness in its early, tentative form, the stage before you trust it, when you're still checking to see if it's real. He came back the following week. He came back the week after that. The visits did not have a formal structure. He would find a reason to be of some use. A fence post that needed setting, a door hinge that had gone stiff, a pump handle that required adjustment, and she would accept the help without debt or gratitude that felt like obligation, and they would talk while the work happened, and then they would eat and talk some more. Aldous Greer noticed his hired hand's regular trips into town, and said nothing because Greer was a man who understood that a good hand worked better when he was not miserable, and Milton was not miserable. He was, in fact, working with a kind of focused energy that Greer had not seen from him before. A man who had always been diligent but was now diligent with purpose, finishing tasks ahead of schedule as though he was working toward something rather than just through something. The town noticed too. Agnes Polk mentioned to the widow Forsyth that she had seen Milton Sawyer's horse tied outside the Callahan place twice in 1 week. The widow Forsyth said that was interesting information and left it there, which was wise, because Minnie Callahan had a way of pulling back from things that were being watched too closely, the way wild things do. What the town did not see was the evening in late October when the wind came up from the north and dropped the temperature by 30 degrees between noon and sundown, and Milton arrived at the Callahan place in the dark to find Minnie trying to drag her supply of firewood from the shed to the house before the coming freeze got into it. The wind was strong enough to knock her sideways, and she was managing it through sheer determination, and he pulled up in the yard and was at her side before she had registered he was there. "You don't have to be here," she said, above the wind. "I know," he said, and picked up half the firewood. They worked together in the dark and the cold, moving the wood by lamplight, stacking it on the porch and in the corner of the kitchen beside the stove. And by the time they were done her hair was completely free of its pins, and she was flushed with cold and exertion, and she looked, he thought, like a woman who had been fighting and winning, which was exactly what she was. She made him stay until the temperature stabilized and the fire was drawing well in the stove, and they sat at her table with hot coffee, and she said, without looking at him, "I'm glad you came." "I saw the weather coming in," he said. "I was going to come anyway." She looked at him then. "Were you?" she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she asked, not challenging, genuinely asking, the way you ask when you want the real answer and not the polished one. He considered how to answer that honestly. "Because I find myself wanting to be here," he said. "I find myself thinking about what you're doing and whether you need anything and whether you're all right. And when I'm here I feel better than when I'm not. And I think you know what that means, even if neither of us has said it out loud yet." She looked at her coffee cup. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was working itself into a proper northern that would leave the ground hard and white by morning. "I know what it means," she said quietly. "Does it frighten you?" he asked. She thought about that honestly in the way she thought about everything. "Yes," she said, "a little." "Me too," he said. She looked up at him. "You?" "Yes," he said. "I've moved a lot, Minnie. I've been in places and left them, and I've had it in my mind for years that I'm a person who moves, that it's just what I do. And then I came to Redemption Creek and I started thinking I don't want to move anymore, and that is much more frightening than moving." She was very still. "I have a quarter section and a house and a wheat field," she said carefully. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "That's the point." They sat with that for a long time, and when he finally rode back to the ranch, the storm had arrived in full, and the snow was coming sideways through the dark, and he could barely see his horse's ears. But he was warm down to his bones in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. November in the Panhandle was the season of settling in, when the work shifted from the outdoor urgency of the growing season to the quieter labor of maintenance and preparation. Milton spent his days at the ranch doing winter work, checking fences and caring for cattle, and doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept an operation running through the cold months. But his evenings and his Sunday afternoons increasingly belonged to the Callahan place. Minnie had a copy of Jane Eyre and a copy of a book about astronomy that she had gotten from a mail-order catalog, and Milton had a habit of reading that he had cultivated through years of long winters in bunkhouses. And so they fell into the habit of reading in the evenings, each with their own book, sitting on opposite sides of the fireplace, and this was, they would both have admitted if asked, one of the most companionable arrangements either of them had known. They talked about the books they were reading. They talked about the wheat and the cattle and the state of the Panhandle in general. They talked about the war that had been over for 17 years, but whose effects you could still see in the way men looked at each other sometimes. a careful measuring that belonged to people who had lived through something irreparable. They talked about the treatment of the Comanche people who had been removed from this very land a handful of years before, pushed onto reservations in Indian Territory, so that cattlemen and wheat farmers could have access to ranges that had belonged to them for generations. Minnie spoke about this with a discomfort that he respected, a recognition that her own presence here was complicated, that the quarter section she was holding onto with both hands existed because other people had been removed from it, and that a person could acknowledge that truth without knowing exactly what to do with it, only that it should not be forgotten. He agreed with her. He had ridden through the panhandle in the years before the Red River War, when the Comanche were still here, and he had seen the way the land changed after they were gone, not just in terms of who lived on it, but in something less definable, something about the quality of attention paid to it. It was a complicated grief, living on land you knew had a history your own arrival had altered, and he thought the right response to it was not guilt that paralyzed but awareness that informed, a kind of responsibility to the place itself that acknowledged what it had been. These conversations deepened something between them that was already deepening through other means, and by the time December arrived, and the town of Redemption Creek put up its modest Christmas decorations, boughs of cedar over the doorways and a wreath on the church door, everyone in town had formed an opinion about Milton Sawyer and Minnie Callahan, and most of those opinions were cautiously hopeful. The widow Forsyth invited them both to her Christmas supper, which was a deliberate and transparent piece of social engineering that both of them were aware of, and that neither of them minded particularly. There were 8 people at the table in the widow's house, which was the largest house in Redemption Creek, and which the widow kept at a temperature that suggested she was personally opposed to winter. Agnes Polk was there, and Hector Briggs, and the Reverend and his wife, and a couple from the eastern edge of town named Harold and Sarah Dunmore, who had 2 small children who ate silently and then fell asleep in the parlor. Milton sat beside Minnie at supper, and he was aware of her throughout the meal in the particular way of a person who is trying to appear normal and not quite succeeding. He was aware of the way she laughed, low and genuine, at something Agnes said about the schoolchildren and their Christmas pageant preparations. He was aware of the way she passed him the bread without thinking about it, as though passing him things was already a habit. He was aware of the slight warmth of her hand when it brushed his reaching across the table, and of the fact that she did not pull back from it quickly. After supper, the men went into the parlor, and the women stayed at the table for a while in the way that was customary, and Milton found himself in conversation with Hector Briggs about the winter wheat prices, and found that he could not maintain full concentration on wheat prices because he was listening to Minnie's voice in the other room, which told him things about himself that he was not surprised by anymore. When they were all saying their good nights on the widow's porch, Milton held Minnie's coat for her, and she paused for just a moment before she put her arms in it, a small pause that was its own kind of acknowledgement, and he thought, standing there in the cold with the stars bright overhead, and the sound of the town settling into its evening quiet, that he was going to say something to her before the year ended. He said it on New Year's Eve. He had ridden out to the Callahan place that afternoon with a small package that contained a pair of good leather-work gloves, the kind that would hold up through hard winters, and a bar of hand soap that smelled faintly of lavender, which he had agonized over in Briggs's store for 15 minutes before Hector had simply taken it off the shelf and put it on the counter and said, "It's practical and it smells nice. She'll appreciate both." Minnie opened the package at the table and looked at the gloves and the soap for a moment, and then she looked up at him. "The gloves are practical," she said. "They are," he agreed. "The soap is not strictly practical." "No," he admitted. "I like it," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not like her usual even tone, something that was warmer and less controlled, and he thought this was the moment. "Minnie," he said. She put the package down on the table and she looked at him steadily, the way she looked at everything when she was paying full attention, which was a kind of attention that made you feel as though every word you said was going to be actually heard, not just registered. And he took a breath and said what he had been working up to for 2 months. "I think you're the most remarkable person I've ever known," he said. "You're the strongest person I know and the most honest and the one whose company I want above anyone else's. And I realize I'm a cowhand on a rented section who has spent his life moving around, and I understand if that is not something you find reassuring. But I want you to know that when I think about the future, you're in it. You and this place and the wheat fields and the apple tree and all of it. And I would like, if you're willing, to court you properly, with the intention of asking you something more permanent in time if you'll let me get that far." He stopped. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved over the grass the way it always did here, constant and searching. She looked at him for a long moment. "You counted the apple tree specifically," she said. "It's an important tree," he said. "It makes good apples." The corner of her mouth moved. "It does," she said. Then more quietly, "I think I've been waiting for you to say something like this for quite a while." "I should have said it sooner," he said. "You said it exactly when it needed saying," she said, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and that was how it became official, though official in this context meant only between the two of them, which was the only place it needed to be official first. He stayed until midnight. They watched the new year come in from the porch, wrapped in blankets, the sky clear and enormous above them, and the stars doing what stars do in the Texas panhandle in January, which is to burn so bright and close they seem almost presumptuous. She stood beside him with her shoulder against his arm, and he thought about all the miles he had ridden and all the places he had been, and all the times he had thought himself a person without a fixed point in the world. And he felt, standing there, that fixed points had a way of finding you when you stopped insisting on moving too fast to be found. He kissed her for the first time on the porch as the new year arrived, 1883 settling over the panhandle like a clean sheet of paper, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward honesty she brought to everything, not tentative but not practiced, just real. And he held her face in his hands and felt the cold of her cheek against his palms and thought, with a clarity that surprised him by being surprising at all, that he had finally arrived somewhere. The courtship that followed was the talk of Redemption Creek in the best possible way. It was not a courtship of elaborate gestures or public displays. It was too practical and too grounded in the real work of two people's lives for that. It was instead a courtship of presence, of Milton arriving at the Callahan place on Sundays with his sleeves already rolled up, ready to be useful, of Minnie appearing at the Double Cross Ranch on the occasional afternoon, with a meal wrapped in cloth that she would hand to him with the specific casualness of someone who is definitely not making a romantic gesture, but absolutely is. It was a courtship of small negotiations, of learning what each other needed and how to give it. Minnie needed independence, and she needed to be seen as capable, and she needed a man who would not try to take things over simply because he could do them. And Milton gave her all of that without being asked, because he had been paying enough attention to know. Milton needed someone who was honest with him and did not perform, someone whose silences were as genuine as her words, and Minnie was that without any effort because she had never known how to be anything else. January gave way to February, and February was when the real winter hit, a stretch of cold so deep that the creek froze solid, and the cattle huddled in the lee of every windbreak they could find, and the people of Redemption Creek stayed close to their fires and saw each other only when necessary. Milton worried about Minnie out on the claim alone, and he made sure she had enough firewood, and that her well was not freezing over and that she had enough food to manage the worst of it. She accepted this attention without making it into something she needed to be saved from, which was the particular grace of a woman who knew the difference between support and condescension. During the worst week of the freeze, he stayed at the Callahan place for 3 days because the roads back to the ranch were impassable and Aldous Greer He was almost certain, anticipated this, and approved it without saying so. He slept in the barn, which was warmer than it had any right to be due to the presence of her horse and a pair of goats she kept for milk. And they spent the evenings at the table in the kitchen, with the lamp burning and the wind screaming outside and the stove working as hard as it could. And they talked and read and argued gently about things that were worth arguing about and agreed loudly about things worth agreeing about. And by the end of those 3 days, there was nothing between them that needed to be carefully navigated anymore. No distances that needed to be crossed with particular care. "I've been thinking," he said on the second evening, the storm still howling outside and both of them drinking coffee that was too strong because Minnie made it too strong, and he had stopped objecting to this on the grounds that he had come to prefer it that way. "About what?" she asked. "About the spring," he said. "Your wheat goes in the spring. You're going to need help." "I know," she said. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that I might have a conversation with Greer about whether there's land adjacent to yours that could be worked, or whether there's another arrangement that might make sense. I have some money saved, not a fortune, but enough to start with." She looked at him across the table. "What kind of arrangement?" she asked. "I think you know what kind of arrangement," he said. "I want to hear you say it," she said, and there was something in her voice that was almost teasing, which he found remarkable because Minnie Callahan teasing was a relatively recent development and one he treasured accordingly. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to work this land with you, and I want to live here, and I want to build something with you that's worth building. I've thought about it from every angle I can think of, and I keep arriving at the same place, which is that I want to be your husband and I want to do the work of that every day for as long as we both live." She did not pause this time. "Yes," she said, "just yes." Clear and complete and entirely Minnie Callahan. He leaned across the table and kissed her, and she put her hand against his jaw, and the fire in the stove was working hard, and outside the wind was trying to knock the world flat, and none of it mattered at all. They were married in March of 1883. The wedding was held in the church that also served as the schoolhouse, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather was cooperating in the modest way of early Texas spring, which meant it was cold but not violently so, and the light was the particular pale gold of the season before green came back into the world. Minnie wore a dress she had made herself from blue fabric that was a slightly lighter shade than the curtains she had sewn in the fall, and the widow Forsythe had lent her a brooch of dark amber that had been the widow's grandmother's, and which sat at Minnie's collar, and caught the light in a way that made Agnes Polk tear up quietly in the third pew. Milton wore his good coat and his good hat, and he had gotten his hair cut specifically for the occasion by the barber, a man named Pete Carver who had opinions about hair that he shared whether or not anyone wanted them. Aldous Greer was there, sitting in the second row with his hat on his knee, and a look on his face that suggested he was someone who had been expecting this. Hector Briggs was there with his best shirt on. The Dunmores were there, and the Reverend was officiating, and the widow Forsythe was in the front row with her best dress and her handkerchief already out. Milton stood at the front of the church and watched Minnie walk down the aisle toward him, and he thought, completely without poetry, that she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen, not because she had dressed for it, though she had, but because she was walking toward him with her chin up and her eyes on his, and the particular expression on her face that he had come to recognize as her truest one, which was fully present, fully honest, fully here. They said their vows in clear voices. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. Milton kissed his wife, and the assembled citizens of Redemption Creek made enough noise about it that it startled Hector Briggs's horse outside. The wedding supper was at the widow Forsythe's house, of course, because the widow had made it clear from the moment. The engagement was announced that the wedding supper was happening at her house, and that this was not a matter for discussion. There was roasted chicken and beans, and 2 kinds of pie, and a cake that Agnes Polk had made from a recipe she had been saving for a special occasion, and there was enough goodwill in that room to keep the whole town warm for the rest of the winter. And since it was March in Texas, the winter was nearly done anyway. Milton danced with his wife to the music of a fiddle player named Lou Carradine, who showed up at most social events in Redemption Creek with his fiddle and his two brothers who played harmonica and bass respectively. And they played waltzes that were slightly too fast and reels that were slightly too loose, and it was exactly right. Milton was not a particularly skilled dancer, but he was enthusiastic, and Minnie had a sense of rhythm that she had been hiding, and together they managed something that was more than the sum of its parts. "You can dance," he said, surprised. "Don't look so shocked," she said. "Where did you learn?" "My father," she said. "He loved to dance. He would have danced at a fence post if it asked him." Milton laughed, and the image of Seamus Callahan dancing with a fence post was suddenly so vivid and so warm that it made Minnie laugh too, and they spun through the widow's parlor laughing and dancing while the fiddle played and the night came on over the panhandle, and the stars came out one by one over Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1883. They moved Milton's things into the Callahan place the following week. He did not have many things. A man who had moved his whole adult life accumulates cautiously, and so it was mostly a matter of a saddlebag and a trunk that contained his good coat, his books, his shaving equipment, and a photograph of his parents taken in Missouri in 1866 that he had been carrying for 17 years. Minnie made room on the shelf beside her astronomy book and her Jane Eyre, and his books went in beside hers, with the matter-of-fact rightness of things that belong where they end up. He resigned from Aldous Greer's employ with a handshake and genuine gratitude, and Greer shook his hand and said he would miss having him on the crew, and that he suspected Minnie Callahan had gotten herself a better deal than she knew, and Milton said he suspected it was the other way around, and Greer snorted and said they'd find out. The spring planting was the first real test of the partnership, and they passed it with the particular grace of two people who had been paying attention to each other long enough to work without many words. Milton brought his knowledge of land and cattle and the particular stubbornness that good farming in the panhandle required, and Minnie brought her knowledge of this specific soil and this specific claim and the 2 growing seasons she had already fought through it. Together they put in more wheat than Minnie had attempted on her own, and they did it efficiently and well. And when the last row was planted and they stood at the edge of the field in the evening light with the soil dark and worked behind them, and the sky going pink and orange to the west, Milton took her hand and she leaned against him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more eloquently. Summer came in with its full panhandle commitment, which was to say it arrived early and stayed long and made itself completely at home. The wheat grew. Milton added some cattle, a small herd to start, a bull and 4 cows that he purchased from Greer at a fair price, and he built a small corral behind the house that was solid enough to hold them, and kept his tools organized along one wall of the barn, with the precision of a man who had spent years knowing that a misplaced tool could cost you time you did not have. They argued sometimes, the way people who live closely together argue, about small things and occasionally about larger ones. Milton had opinions about the best way to lay out a kitchen garden, and Minnie had better opinions about the best way to lay out a kitchen garden, and they had a prolonged and largely good-natured dispute about the spacing of the bean rows that the widow Forsyth, when consulted, resolved in Minnie's favor. Milton accepted this with the equanimity of a man who knows when he has been outmatched. They found their rhythm. They found the way that 2 people who have both been largely solitary learn to share a space and a life, the adjustments that are not really concessions but are instead discoveries. Here is a new way of being that is better than the old one. Milton learned that Minnie needed the first half hour of the morning to be quiet, that she could not manage conversation before her coffee and her first look out the window at the day, and he learned to be quiet with her in the mornings in a way that was its own kind of intimacy. Minnie learned that Milton worked through problems by talking about them, and that the talking was not a request for solutions but simply the process, and she learned to listen without trying to solve, which was the greatest gift she could have given him. In the evenings they sat on the porch when the weather allowed, and Milton smoked his pipe occasionally, and Minnie would sometimes bring her mending and sometimes just sit, and they would watch the stars come out over the flatlands and talk about the day and about the future and about the world. And sometimes they would not talk at all, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence either of them had known. By the end of that first summer, the wheat harvest was the best the Callahan quarter section had produced. They brought it in together with 2 days of hired help, the Dawson boy Clem, who was 15 now and could do a full day's work, and a man from town named Robertson who worked harvests for anyone who needed him. Milton drove the wagon and Minnie worked alongside the men with the same unhesitating physicality she brought to everything. And by the end of the second day, the wheat was in, and Milton's hands were blistered, and his back was aching, and he had never in his life felt more satisfied with a day's work. They sold the wheat at a price that was not spectacular but was solid, and the money went into improvements: a better pump for the well, new lumber for repairs to the east side of the barn that had been letting wind in seed for the following year. Minnie kept the accounts in a ledger with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and the numbers were not lavish, but they showed a trajectory that was going in the right direction, which was all that could be asked of a first full year. News came through Redemption Creek in October that year, the way news came through all small towns, via the stage line and the mail, and the steady commerce of people coming through. There was news from the east about the expansion of the railroads, which would change everything about how cattle moved and how goods were priced, and how isolated places like Redemption Creek related to the rest of the country. There was news from Indian Territory about conditions on the reservations that was not good, and that Milton read about in the newspaper Hector Briggs kept behind the counter, and that he and Minnie talked about in the way they talked about things that troubled them, carefully and without resolution, but with the maintenance of awareness that seemed like the least they could do. There was also, closer to home, the matter of a man named Cutter Voss who had taken an interest in a piece of land adjacent to the Callahan property, and whose interest was not the friendly kind. Voss was a cattleman with larger holdings north of Redemption Creek, a man who had come west with money and used it to accumulate more, and he had an idea that the Callahan quarter section would make good additional range for his cattle in the winter months, and he had expressed this idea first through an offer that was insultingly below value, and then through a series of less formal pressures that included letting his cattle drift across the Callahan boundary fence repeatedly and deliberately. Milton fixed the fence each time. He did it without dramatic confrontation, quietly and with care, making the fence better each time he fixed it, and he sent a letter through the land office clearly establishing the boundary survey. Minnie wrote a separate letter that was, by her own description, polite but unambiguous, and the widow Forsyth, who had known Cutter Voss for 20 years and had opinions about him that she had been waiting to express, made sure those opinions reached the right people in the local business community. Voss came to the house one afternoon in November, riding up with 2 of his men in a way that was clearly intended to be imposing. Milton was in the corral when he arrived and he walked out to meet him, not hurrying, and Minnie appeared on the porch with her arms crossed and her expression that of a woman who had been expecting this and had thoughts about it. Voss made his offer again, a little higher this time, still below value, with an air of generosity that was thoroughly unearned. Milton listened to the whole thing and then said, pleasantly, that the answer was no and had always been no and would continue to be no, and that if Voss's cattle came across the boundary again, he would be speaking to the county sheriff about it. He said all of this without raising his voice and with the particular calm of a man who is completely certain of his position, Voss looked at him and then at Minnie on the porch and then back at Milton. He said something that was intended to be threatening but landed as bluster, and then he and his men rode off, and Minnie came down from the porch and stood beside Milton watching them go. "Well," she said. "He'll try once more," Milton said, "and then he'll find something else to do with his time." "You're very confident about that. He's a man who takes the easy path," Milton said. "We are not the easy path." He was right. Voss's cattle crossed the boundary one more time in December, and Milton reported it to the sheriff and filed the necessary complaint. And after that the cattle stayed on their own side of the line and Voss directed his acquisitive attention elsewhere, as men like him always do when they encounter genuine resistance. They marked their first anniversary in March of 1884 quietly, just the two of them on the porch with coffee and the promise of spring in the air, the grass beginning to go green at the roots, and the apple tree already showing the preliminary signs of coming back to life, tiny hard buds on the tips of the branches that would become leaves and then blossoms, and then, in the fullness of summer, apples. "Where do you think we'll be in 10 years? Minnie asked, which was an unusual question for her. She was more of a practical present circumstances person than a speculative future one. Milton thought about it. "Here," he said. "I think we'll be here." "That's not very specific." "Here," he said, "with more wheat and more cattle and probably some improvements to the house, and I think there might be a child or two in the picture if you're of a mind." She looked at him sideways. "If I'm of a mind," she said. "You're always of a mind about things," he said. "That's one of your qualities." She was quiet for a moment. "I would like children," she said. "I've been thinking about it." "Have you?" he said. "I have," she said. "I think you'd be a good father." He felt something move in his chest, a kind of gravity toward her that was physical and not physical at the same time. "I'd work hard at it," he said. "I know what it looks like when it's done well. My mother did it well." "Tell me about her," Minnie said. She had heard some of this before, but she was asking for more, and he gave it to her, talking about his mother through the morning and into noon, the way she had kept a garden in Missouri, and the way she had read to him at night, and the way she had stood up for him with his father when she could, and that it had not always been enough, but it had always been something. Minnie told him more about Seamus that day, too, about the way he had told stories, and the way he had cried without embarrassment when things were sad and laughed without restraint when things were funny, and had loved this land the way some people love a person, deeply and with full acceptance of its flaws. "I carry them both," she said. "I think that's all you can do with the people you've lost. Carry them and let them be part of what you build." "Yes," Milton said. "I think that's exactly right." Their son was born in the winter of 1885, the 3rd of January, on a night when the stars were out, and the cold was dry and still, and the lamp burned steadily in the bedroom while the widow Forsyth, who had midwifed half the births in Redemption Creek over the past 20 years, moved with confident efficiency, and told many things in a low, steady voice that were both medically accurate and profoundly reassuring. Milton sat in the kitchen because the widow had sent him there with the authority of a woman who had handled considerably more dramatic situations than an anxious husband, and he sat at the table that had been the site of so many conversations, and ate nothing, because he could not eat, and drank coffee that he could not taste, and listened to the sounds from the bedroom with a focused intensity that would have been alarming to anyone watching. When the widow came to the kitchen door and told him he had a son, he stood up so fast the chair scraped back, and she had to hold up one hand to indicate that he should walk and not run. The baby was small and red and entirely himself, already pressing his face against Minnie's shoulder with the specific purposefulness of a person who knows what he wants. Minnie was exhausted and luminous, and she looked at Milton when he came in with an expression that he could not fully process because it was too large for his current emotional capacity, an expression of love so complete it included everything. He sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son. "He has your chin," Minnie said. "God help him," Milton said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. They named him Seamus James Sawyer. Seamus for her father, James for Milton's mother's father, whose name had been the thing he had liked best about his mother's family in Missouri. Seamus James Sawyer arrived in the world at 2 in the morning on the 3rd of January, 1885, and he announced himself loudly and kept it up for some time, which the widow Forsythe said was an excellent sign, and which Milton found he did not mind at all. The widow Forsythe, who was staying the night because she always stayed the night after a birth, came to the kitchen eventually and found Milton sitting at the table with his son in his arms, looking at him with the expression of a man who has been profoundly rearranged. "First time?" the widow asked, sitting down across from him. "First time," he said. "Changes things," she said. "Yes," he said. "Your wife is sleeping," the widow said. "She did beautifully." "She does everything beautifully," Milton said, without looking up from Seamus. The widow smiled the smile of someone who has seen a great deal of life and knows what the good parts look like. "She does," she agreed. The spring of 1885 was busy in the way of springs with an infant in the house, which was to say it was thoroughly demanding and exhausting, and completely worth it. Seamus James Sawyer turned out to be a baby of strong opinions and efficient communication, expressing those opinions through a range of vocalizations that kept both of his parents intimately aware of whether those opinions were being properly addressed. He was also, when not registering opinions, the most peaceful thing either of them had ever looked at, sleeping in the wooden cradle Milton had made through the winter nights with a careful attention to craft that Minnie had watched with equal attention. The wheat went in and the cattle were doing well, and the town of Redemption Creek had grown a little since their arrival. 3 new families and a proper doctor who had set up a practice in a small building beside the land office, which was a significant improvement over the previous arrangement of hoping for the best and getting the nearest doctor from the county seat when things were serious. Agnes Polk had married a man who had come through town on the stage and decided to stay, a carpenter named Harris who built furniture with the same thoughtfulness Agnes brought to teaching, and they were already expecting their first child. The widow Forsythe was, as always, exactly the widow Forsythe, tending her geraniums and her social connections and her considerable store of knowledge about everyone in Redemption Creek, with the same brisk affection that had characterized her every interaction since the day she had arrived in this place decades before. Hector Briggs had hired a young woman named Clara as his assistant in the store, and there were quiet signals, the way he straightened his shirt when she was nearby, the way she laughed a little too readily at his rare attempts at humor, that suggested the general store might be the site of a different kind of development than merely commercial. Milton mentioned this to Minnie one evening, and she said she had been aware of it for 2 months, and was waiting to see whether Hector would manage to say anything about it before the year ended. And they had a pleasant discussion about whether Hector Briggs was more likely to be deliberate or more likely to be terrible at being deliberate. Hector, as it turned out, proposed to Clara in October in the general store over a barrel of pickles, which was thoroughly in character, and Clara accepted with an enthusiasm that made Hector look as though he had been expecting the floor to give way and was pleasantly surprised to find it solid. The town went on. Redemption Creek grew in the way of places that have found their footing, a new building here, an expanded operation there, people arriving and occasionally leaving, but the core of the place remaining stable and itself. The railroad survey that had been rumored for years was confirmed in 1886 as coming through 20 miles south of town, which was not close enough to change everything but close enough to change some things, and there were long conversations in the general store and at the church about what that meant and how to respond to it. Milton had opinions about the railroad that were primarily practical. He thought the proximity would help with getting cattle to market and reduce the cost of goods coming in, and he argued this steadily and without drama in the conversations where it came up. Minnie had opinions about the railroad that were slightly more complex. She had read enough about what the expansion of the railroad had done to indigenous communities throughout the West to have reservations about celebrating it without qualification. And she said so in the same direct way she said everything. And people listened because she was known to think before she spoke. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1887, the 15th of April, a Tuesday, on a morning of extraordinary yellow light when the wheat was coming up green in the field, and the apple tree was in full blossom, white flowers against a blue sky. The widow Forsyth was present again, having made it clear 2 years before that she would expect to be called for any Sawyer births as a matter of course, and the birth was quicker than Seamus's had been, which the widow said was generally the way of second children, as though they had listened to the first one's experience and decided to be more efficient about it. The baby was a girl, dark-haired and intent from the first moment, looking around at the world with the focused attention of someone who has arrived somewhere new and intends to understand it. Minnie held her and Milton sat beside them both, and Seamus, who was 2 years old and consequently had very strong feelings about most things that happened in his vicinity, was brought in and introduced and expressed his feelings about his new sister by trying to give her his piece of corn bread, which was the highest compliment a 2-year-old could bestow. They named her Mary Eloise Sawyer. Mary for the name Minnie's mother had carried, which Minnie had never been able to say without a complicated mix of grief and love, and Eloise for no particular reason except that it sat well with Mary, and that it was a name that sounded like it belonged to someone with opinions, which seemed appropriate given her lineage. The years that followed had the quality of a good life lived at full attention, which is to say they were full of everything. Full of work and weather, and the daily negotiations of a partnership between two strong-willed people, who loved each other deeply enough to keep choosing each other through the moments when choosing was harder. Full of Seamus growing from a baby of opinions into a small boy of more structured opinions, showing early signs of the same methodical approach to problems that characterized his mother, and the same easy sociability that characterized his father. A combination that the widow Forsyth said with satisfaction was exactly what you would expect from those two particular people. Full of Mary growing from an intent observer into a child who walked early and talked early and had, by the age of 3, a vocabulary that regularly surprised people who were not paying attention. She loved the apple tree. She had decided on this specific affection when she was 18 months old and had expressed it consistently since, patting the bark of it when she walked past, sitting at its roots in the summer, regarding it with a proprietary satisfaction that Milton found endlessly entertaining. "She knows it was an apple from that tree that started everything," Minnie said once, watching Mary toddle purposefully toward the tree from the porch. "She can't know that," Milton said. "She knows what she knows," Minnie said, which was both completely illogical and completely in the spirit of how Minnie thought about the world when she let herself be a little unguarded. The farm expanded. They added land in 1888, purchasing an adjacent parcel at a fair price from a family who had decided to move to New Mexico, and with the added acreage, they were able to run a larger cattle operation alongside the wheat. Milton was good at both, and he had a natural feeling for the land that went beyond technique, an instinct for when to plant and when to hold back, and when the weather was about to do something that required adjustment, the kind of knowledge that comes from years of paying close attention to things larger than yourself. They hired a farmhand in 1889, a young man named Evan Torres who was 20 years old, and had come up from San Antonio with recommendations and good hands, and a willingness to learn that made him worth every penny of the wage they paid him. He proved himself through a hard summer, and then stayed on through the fall, and then through the winter, and eventually just stayed, becoming part of the operation in the way that good people become part of things, through demonstrated reliability and mutual respect. The town of Redemption Creek in 1890 was a different place than the one Milton had ridden into 8 years before, larger and more connected to the wider world, with a proper post office now and a second doctor, and a school building that was a school building only, children no longer having to share it with the Sunday congregation. Agnes Polk Harris was still teaching there, 23 children in the one-room school, and she was the best teacher those children were going to find anywhere in that county, and everyone knew it. Milton took Seamus to visit the school one morning in the fall when Seamus was 5, old enough to begin, and he sat in the back of the room and watched his son sit very straight at a small desk and listen to Agnes with the same focused attention that Minnie gave to things she was trying to understand. He felt something in that moment that he did not have a ready word for, the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something that extends beyond himself, whose children are being taught by good people, in a place that has been made better by the accumulation of many people's steady efforts. He thought about Redemption Creek the way you think about a place that has become yours, not in the possessive sense but in the sense of belonging, of mutual claim. He had arrived here as a man without a fixed point, and he had been given one, or had found one, or had built one, perhaps all three, and the roots he had put down were deep enough now that he could not imagine being pulled out of them without loss of something essential. Minnie was in the kitchen when he came home that evening, Mary on her hip and a letter in her other hand, which she extended toward him when he came through the door. "From your father," she said. He took it and looked at the Missouri postmark. His father wrote 3 or 4 times a year now, careful letters that were not warm exactly but were not cold, the letters of a man who is trying and who knows that trying at this stage of things is what he has to offer. Milton always wrote back. He would write back to this one too, and tell his father about Seamus starting school and about the good harvest and about the way the panhandle looked in September, amber and gold and enormous. "He's getting older," Milton said, meaning his father. "He is," Minnie said. "You should visit." "I've been thinking about it," he said. "Think harder," she said, not unkindly. "He's not going to be there forever and you'd regret it." He knew she was right, as she was right about most things. He wrote to his father that evening and proposed a visit in the spring, when the planting was done and before the summer work began, and his father wrote back inside of 2 weeks to say that he would like that very much. They went in April of 1891, the whole family, a journey of several days by train from the nearest station, 20 miles south of Redemption Creek. Seamus and Mary both pressed to the windows watching the country chain as they moved north and east, the flat openness of the panhandle giving way to greener country as they went. Milton watched the landscape chain and felt something complicated in his chest, the feeling of moving back towards something that had been left behind, not with dread but with the careful anticipation of a person who has become capable of returning to hard places, because he is now strong enough in himself to do it. His father, Luther Sawyer, was 71 years old and had shrunk somewhat from the man in Milton's memory, the way people who were large when we were small sometimes do, the dimensions of our memory exceeding the actual person. He met them at the station with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving between Milton and Minnie and the 2 children, and when he looked at Milton, there was something in his face that was so much more than Milton had been prepared for that he had to work to keep his expression steady. "You look like your mother," Luther said. "People say that," Milton said. There was a moment. And then Luther put out his hand and Milton took it, and then somehow it became something more than a handshake, not a great dramatic scene, just a brief firm hold, 2 men across a long silence, and then it was done and Luther was turning to Minnie and saying he was glad to finally meet her because he had read about her enough in Milton's letters to feel he knew her, and Minnie said she was glad to meet him too. And Mary immediately went to Luther and put her hand in his because she was 4 years old and had not yet learned to be careful about people, which was the most valuable gift a child could give an old man. They stayed a week. It was not a perfect week. There were moments of awkwardness and old weight that could not be made light by goodwill alone, but it was a real week, full of the substance of things being attempted genuinely. And when they left, Luther shook Milton's hand again and then, after a moment of visible internal conflict, put his arms around him briefly, and Milton held on for a moment, and that was something. That was more than something. On the train home, Minnie leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and Seamus was asleep across the seat opposite them, and Mary was asleep with her head in Seamus's lap. And the train moved through the darkening country, and he thought about his father and his mother and Seamus Callahan and all the people who were carried by the people sitting in this train car, all the weight and love of those lost. "Thank you," he said quietly to Minnie. "For what?" she said. "For making me go," he said. "I didn't make you," she said. "You made me think harder about it," he said, "which is basically the same thing." She laughed softly, careful not to wake the children. "You're welcome," she said. They arrived home in the morning, the train and then the wagon and then the familiar track up to the house. And when they came over the last rise and the Callahan place came into view, the house solid in the morning light and the wheat in the east field already showing green and the apple tree in the yard just beginning its annual promise, Milton pulled the wagon to a stop and just looked at it for a moment. "What's wrong?" Minnie asked. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing at all." She followed his gaze and she understood, because she was a person who understood things without needing them explained. And she put her hand over his where it rested on the reins, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the horses stood patiently in the morning, and the children dozed in the wagon bed, and the light moved over the panhandle the way it always did, enormous and without opinion, falling equally on everything it touched. Evan Torres had kept the place running in their absence and had done it with his usual thoroughness, and the animals were well, and the fences were sound, and there was a pot of beans on the stove in the kitchen that he had left ready for their return, which was the kind of thoughtfulness that made a person irreplaceable. The summer of 1891 was a good one. The wheat came in well, the cattle were healthy, and there was a stretch in August when the weather cooperated so completely that it felt almost extravagant, warm and dry, and with enough rain at the right times to keep the grass from going brittle. They had a harvest supper that year and invited half the town, setting up tables in the yard under the sky. And the widow Forsyth came, and Agnes and her husband and Hector Briggs, and his wife Clara and the Dunmores and Evan Torres and Lou Carradine and his brothers, because no gathering in Redemption Creek was complete without the fiddle, and it went on past dark with the lanterns lit, and the music going, and the children running between the tables until they were falling over with tiredness. The widow Forsyth sat beside Milton at one point in the evening and looked out at the yard full of people and said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched something develop from the very beginning, "I remember when you rode into this town and couldn't figure out how to say good morning to one particular woman." "I figured it out," Milton said. "You did," the widow said. "Eventually. Are you complaining about how long it took?" "I'm observing," she said. "There's a difference." "Not when you do it," he said, and the widow laughed, a real laugh, the laugh of someone who is very old and has known enough joy to recognize it clearly. Milton looked across the yard to where Minnie was standing with Mary on her hip, talking to Agnes with the ease of two women who have known each other long enough to skip the preamble. And Minnie must have felt him looking, because she looked up and across the distance, and her eyes found his in the lamplight. And she smiled, not the small controlled smile of the woman he had first watched walking out of Briggs's general store with her basket on her arm, but a full smile, a smile that had nothing careful in it. The smile of a woman who is where she means to be and knows it. He held that moment consciously, the way you hold a good moment when you are aware enough to know you're in one, the sound of the fiddle and the smell of the late summer air, and the light playing over the faces of people he had built a life among, and his wife's smile across the yard, and the particular fullness of a life that had been chosen at every step. The years continued their honest work. Seamus grew into a boy who was good with numbers and with animals, and who had a way of making friends that reminded Milton of himself at that age, easy and genuine, without calculation. He was, by 10, already helping with the cattle in a real way, not just the supervised participation of a child being given something to do, but actual useful work that he performed with the steady pride of someone discovering their own capability. Mary at 8 was reading everything she could get her hands on. She had finished the books in the house and was working her way through the school library and making regular requests of Hector Briggs to order specific titles from the catalog, which Hector did with the resigned affection of a man who has discovered that the children of certain families are simply going to cost him catalog fees indefinitely. She wanted to be a teacher, she announced with great certainty at dinner one evening, and then reconsidered and said perhaps a doctor, and then said probably both, which Milton allowed was ambitious and Minnie said was entirely reasonable. Their third child arrived in 1893, another son, born in July on a day of tremendous heat that the widow Forsyth managed stoically, because she had been managing births in this house for 8 years and was not to be deterred by weather. Thomas Callahan Sawyer, named for the Callahan name carried forward, and for Thomas, which was simply a name that sat well in the mouth. He was from the start a placid and observant child, the counterpoint to his older siblings' various intensities, watching the world with a patience that seemed unlikely in an infant, and that never entirely left him. The family that Minnie had wondered about in 1884, that Milton had described as probably including a child or two, had become 3 children and a farm and a life so thoroughly interwoven with the life of a town that it was impossible now to think of one without the other. Milton Sawyer, who had ridden into Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1882 as a drifting hand without a fixed point in the world, was by 1893 a man with roots deep enough that the word home had recovered its full meaning for him, a meaning he had not been sure it still had. He thought sometimes about the version of himself who had ridden past the Callahan place 4 times in a single hour because he could not figure out how to stop. He thought about the morning with the wagon wheel and the apple given by way of thanks, and about the curtains of dark blue wool, and about the cold November evening when they had moved firewood together in the dark, and she had said she was glad he had come. He thought about the New Year's Eve when he had finally said what needed saying, and she had said yes, clear and complete, without a pause. He thought about all the small, ordinary days that had accumulated into the thing they had built, each one unremarkable on its own and together, amounting to something he could not have imagined from the bunkhouse at the Double Cross Ranch in 1882, not because he had been incapable of imagining it, but because imagination requires some foundation to build on, and he had not yet met the particular person who was the foundation of this specific life. One evening in late October of 1893, when the harvest was done and Thomas was sleeping and Seamus and Mary were at the table doing their schoolwork, and the fire was going in the stove, and the wind was doing its usual work outside, Milton came in from the barn and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment, just standing there looking at the scene in front of him. His children at the table and his wife at the stove, and the lamp burning, and the braided rug on the floor and the shelf of books beside the window, where his books and hers had been mixed together long enough that they could no longer be separated into which belonged to whom. Minnie turned from the stove and saw him standing there. "Are you going to come in or stand there looking like you've seen something remarkable?" she said. "I have seen something remarkable," he said. "It's just supper," she said. "It's not just supper," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the full green-eyed attention that had not lost any of its particular power over the decade that had passed. Then she said, in the quiet voice she kept for the things that mattered most, "No, it isn't." He came in and closed the door behind him against the October wind, and the kitchen was warm, and his children bent over their books and his wife went back to the stove, and the apple tree outside in the yard was bare now, its leaves all gone with the season, but underneath the bark of it the tree was already carrying next year's growth, already beginning the slow internal work that would show itself again in the spring as blossoms, and then as fruit, patient and faithful and returning. the way things do when they have put down roots deep enough to hold. Later that night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Minnie sat beside him at the kitchen table and they drank their too-strong coffee, and she took his hand across the table in the way she had done on New Year's Eve 11 years before, the first time, when she had turned his sentence about the future into a thing they were building together. "Are you happy?" she asked, not because she needed to ask it, but because she was a woman who believed in saying things directly rather than letting them be assumed. He looked at her hand in his, the strong, capable hand of a woman who had worked this land through droughts and cold and the death of her father and the full demanding life of everything that had come after, and he thought about the word happy, whether it was large enough for what he felt, whether it covered the depth of it. "Completely," he said. "Entirely, in every direction." She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said. "So am I." Outside, the wind came down from the north the way it always did in October, moving over the flat, dark panhandle, over the wheat fields and the cattle ranges, and the small towns of people who had chosen to make their lives in this particular piece of the world, this enormous sky and this hard-giving land. And in the house on the Callahan Quarter section, the lamp burned steady and the fire held and the children slept, and the two people at the table held each other's hands across the wood that had been scrubbed pale with years of living, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.